Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yousef. You've given us a lot to think about here and perhaps also a lot to worry about. So you've painted a picture of a changed world where the rules that we are familiar with will no longer apply. You also spoke of fierce competition between the world's economic powerhouses and the reversal of trends like globalization, which have come with both opportunities and disadvantages for smaller economies. So let me ask you a few questions and then we'll throw it open for discussion. I invite the audience to send questions through the Q&A function of Zoom, but I will ask you 2 or 3 questions to start with. And I wanted to ask you about the impact of the conflict between the US and China. How is that going to shape the economy, the world economy?
Well, that is going to be one of the main elements of the international economic scene in the coming years. The Chinese are not accepting the rule-based system that was established by the West. The Bretton Woods agreements, the IMF, the World Bank, the BIS, the WTO, etc. China doesn't agree with this. China has as an intention to become a main, if not the main player economically and possibly politically. So there will be conflict. They have done a lot, they have made a lot of mistakes in the past in stealing IP, technology, etc., that should have been dealt with. What the US did, maybe not as extreme as the Trump administration did, but what the US did, which is fight back, they should have done multilaterally, not bilaterally, and not using tariffs, using the existing procedures to make sure. But the competition between the US, between China and the rest of the world, it's not going to be China-US, it's going to be China and the West, is going to shape trade flows, because many countries will realize they don't want to be dependent on China for many of their inputs. You see, for example, 5G technology depends on components that come from China. Many countries have cut it off. And they said, no, we will build the industry that is self-sufficient. So there'll be a movement towards self-sufficiency, a movement toward retraction. And the world will sort of break up into 2 camps, Chinese sphere and Western sphere. We, as an emerging market economy, want to make sure we stay in the middle. We can't afford to be on one side to the other because we need both. So it'll be very tricky to remain in the world scene without suffering damage from the fight between the 2 giants.
Thank you. And can I ask you to describe a bit what will happen in our region, the Middle East and North Africa? We have oil importers, oil exporters, the whole oil economy is changing, and some of our countries have relied on globalization to supply markets abroad, auto industry in Morocco, for instance. What's going to happen in our region, and what should policymakers press on this?
Well, there are 2 groups, the oil importers and the oil exporters. The oil exporters are the commodity companies. They're no different from the African economies that are reliant on copper or on bauxite or on one major commodity. These are single commodity economies. These will seek to diversify. They need to diversify desperately. And to do that, they need to spend some of their wealth. Some of their sovereign wealth fund have to be directed towards diversification. They have to direct that towards increasing the productivity of their population. They have resources that can raise the level of education of their population, raise their productivity, and therefore this is where they need to focus. And they will do that But to do that, they have to establish systems whereby it's not an economy that works budget constraint. If I look at the number of oil producers in the Middle East, for years, for decades, they worked without a budget constraint. Whatever they wanted, they spent. They had money, they had a surplus, and whatever they wanted, they spent. Now, they need to generate resources. They can't continue to do this. They can't continue to rely on oil because oil is going to gradually be declining over time. With all of the agreements for climate control, oil is going to be less important. Unless, and this is where they could invest money, you have new technologies for carbon capture. Technologies that capture the carbon that comes out from using hydrocarbons and helps the rest of the world fight. The oil importers are facing what the rest of the world is facing. A massive crash in employment, a massive crash in their capital stock and in productive capacity, and a competition on the world scene. So one, they need to make sure they preserve the capital stock, like I said. Also, they need to make sure they remain competitive. They remain in the international marketplace because there will be a lot of competition. And the only way for them to maintain production, to maintain employment, is not going to be the domestic market. It's going to be the international market. So you better take the policy that keeps you in the international market.
So when you speak about the policy that keeps you in the international market, because also we need to create jobs, we need to attract FDI. So these policies are going to be very difficult to implement.
They are difficult, yes, they are difficult, and they involve choices. You're going to have to choose. One of the countries that I helped had two choices. They needed to move their currency. Their currency was overvalued. And I told them, look, you're not going to be able to stay in the international market with a currency like this. You need to depreciate your currency. The reason why the currency was overvalued is that they were very attractive to North American carry trade. North Americans are investing in their bills, financial paper, that was giving 7, 8, and 9% return, which sort of lowered made their currency appreciate, a bit like what happened in Egypt. So the question was, do you want to keep this, or do you want to stay competitive and create jobs? If you want to create jobs, you're going to have to either do something about the carry trade, do something about the exchange rate, or do something about both. The reason the policy they took was to put a tax on carry trade, saying, if you come in for less than 3 years, you're going to pay me an exit tax of 20%. If you want to come in and stay, immediately the currency started moving up, returning to a proper valuation that was not distorted by the carry trade. Now, obviously, this involved some inflation. Since the market was pretty dead, the inflation was very minimal. But it's a policy choice. Other countries will not do that policy choice or have other priorities. So it's not easy. And you need to know intimately the tools you are using. You can't have a superficial knowledge of how an economy works or what tools you have. I help these countries along with 4 other economists worldwide, all of them trained in top universities in the world. And we often disagree because there are different priorities and different trade-offs. So it's not easy. And you need to know intimately what kind of instruments you're using if you're going to do what you need to do to keep the economy going.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yousef. We've received many questions from the audience, so I'm going to select a few. We've got around 25 minutes. So let me start with a question from Karim Goma. In the existing pandemic, what are your recommendations for boosting entrepreneurship and startups with the challenges of unemployment and self-funding for startups in Egypt?
The transmission broke up a bit. What are the recommendations for what?
Boosting entrepreneurship and startups, given the challenges of employment and funding.
Well, at this stage, I would recommend government intervention. Provide resources to the startups, to the small and micro enterprises, either to survive if they were already established, or to set up shop if they haven't been established. I would immediately come in with grant money or with equity. If we can't afford grant money, we can put equity. I say, okay, I will come in at 20% or 30% of your capital, and I will help you set yourself up, or help them improve their productivity. Startups often require training, require resources, require machinery, etc., computers, things of that nature. I would intervene to help out. This is important because this is going to be the base later on, after the pandemic has been dealt with, the base that is going to offer employment, tax returns, and all of the necessary resources for me to recover from this mess.
Right, and we have another question here from Yousef Bishay. How do you see potential risks to your recommended fiscal policy, which is based on high leverage? Could emerging market governments default if global monetary policy shifts away from lower for longer rates, and if the US-China trade war rematerializes as in the first half of 2018?
Yes. Well, the policy choices we have now, it's as Yousef said, it's high leverage. We're borrowing a lot of money domestically, and some are borrowing internationally. We have to keep in mind that developed countries are pouring tons of money in their economies. They are making liquidity extremely cheap, zero interest or negative interest. Sooner or later, in 2-3 years, they're going to have to withdraw this liquidity from the market. And therefore, they will occasion rises in interest rates. So we cannot rely on the fact that international interest rates are going to be very low for very long, for forever. And therefore, we have to take precautions. One, in limiting our borrowing from abroad. Two, in trying to address restructure our foreign indebtedness if it is going to be a problem. And three, for some countries, and I've suggested in another forum that the IMF issue a new issue of SDRs globally, but in some countries, debt forgiveness. Take the example of Zambia. Zambia, there's no way they're going to be able to repay their foreign indebtedness. So this will have to be taken care of, and debt will have to be reduced, canceled. Now, so he's very right in pointing out the fact that the international environment is not going to be the way it is for very long, for much longer, maybe another year, 2 years, and after that, the countries will have to pull back. The war between the US and China was between the US and China and was focused on tariffs, but it's going to expand. And the world has to realize, they are beginning to realize, that the relationship with China will have to be on 3 levels. One, they have to join forces. They have to partner with them on issues that require partnering, like climate control. Two, they have to compete with them on areas where the Chinese and the West are competitors and therefore can compete on a level playing field. And three, they are going to be the enemy in a number of areas where the Chinese do not wish to share their know-how or wish to steal know-how from others or wish to dominate certain areas of technology, of cyber knowledge, etc. There, the Chinese will be the enemy. And therefore, we have to keep in mind that emerging market economies need to position themselves so as to stay away from the conflicting part, the conflict part which harms us. And therefore, it's tricky. You're going to have to follow what happens in the rest of the world on a day-to-day basis to make sure that you stay away from the hot areas and you stay in the areas where you are protected, you are welcomed, you are competing on a level playing field, and you are safe from the clash between the two giants.
Thank you very much. And we have also another question here from Mr. Hamid Hassouna El-Birri. And his question is, measures as well as the initiatives adopted by the Egyptian government and the Central Bank of Egypt were effective, including the declining interest rate trend. What measures and initiatives would you advise for 2021?
That's a very difficult question. Very, very difficult, because for me to be able to give you advice, I know too much and I don't know enough. I know too much about the Egyptian economy, but then which makes me realize that I don't know enough. I cannot give you a recommendation on what should be done in Egypt. I need to know a lot more than what is available publicly, very rightly so. Many data should not be available publicly, but I am sure they are available to the policymaker, and therefore, forgive me, I can't give you any kind of advice without having much more intimate knowledge of the variables at hand in Egypt. But I know that you are in competent hands. So whatever it is they're doing must be what I would do if I was exposed to the same data.
Right. Okay, and we have another question here from Rania Fuad. She would like to know if renewable energy sources already took a huge market share, especially under the umbrella of the SDGs. Will oil and other conventional energy resources disappear gradually?
Well, disappear, no, but they will become more expensive to use. There will be carbon taxes, there will be all sorts of taxes aimed at climate control, at salvaging the climate. So it'll be more and more expensive to use hydrocarbons that generate pollution. On the other hand, a country like Egypt has massive opportunity for renewable energy. We have a sun that doesn't quit. We could provide most of Europe with solar energy. We have wind corridors in Egypt that could produce gigawatts of electricity through wind thing. So we can concentrate in these areas and make it such that we are one of the leaders of the countries that provide renewable energy, clean energy to the rest of the world. One obvious investment sector would be solar energy. Look at the Western Desert. There's hardly a cloud all year round. Why can't we put 100 acres of solar panels and export the energy to Europe? This would be a massive addition. And I am sure that a number of countries that cannot meet their carbon targets would be happy to invest in Egypt so as to compensate not meeting their carbon targets by having their energy supplied by a renewable source. So there are massive possibilities. Hydrocarbons will not disappear. It will take a long time for us to be able to move away from them, but they will become more expensive to use. And therefore, we have to plan in that respect.
Thank you. And another question from Abanoub Rifat. How can we deal with industry level concentration? Many sectors in Egypt have a very high level of concentration and put pressure on market efficiency. How can we provide assistance to SMEs?
This is why years ago, along with other colleagues we passed the competition law to create an institution that protects competition and that makes sure that there is a level playing field for everybody and that nobody engages in competitive practice. Strengthen that organization, strengthen the people who are in there. They are crucial to the proper functioning of the economy. Get competent people. I remember I spoke months ago to a young man who was at the head of the competition authority, quite knowledgeable, very intelligent, well versed in competitive theory. This is the kind of person you want in there. You want staff like this so as to protect the small enterprises. And there are measures that governments can take to promote small enterprises against the dominance of the large players in the market. But competition is crucial. And the competition authority in any emerging market economy becomes very important if you're going to generate a wide base of employment generation.
Right, and there is another question from Dr. Gamal Heikel, and he's asking if there is a risk if the world is heading towards stagflation, given massive quantitative easing and debt explosion and all the borrowing and indebtedness. Is that going to come back and haunt us?
Stagflation, probably not. Because as soon as there's going to be a hint of inflation, the countries are going to take measures. So, but stagnation, it's possible. It may not be stagnation because there's been such a drop in economic activity that anything will move the needle up. So any movement will look like positive growth. So, but low growth, yes. Tricky monetary policy, yes. How do I reabsorb all of this liquidity without crashing the economy? It's going to be challenging. And we invented new policies to deal with the pandemic, I am sure we're going to invent new policies to deal with the fallout, and therefore how to resorb the liquidity without crashing the economy, without having interest rates go through the roof, and therefore investment collapsing and growth collapsing. Right now, nobody is thinking about this because that we know that for the next 2-3 years, we're going to have a problem just generating jobs, generating growth. But everybody has in the back of their mind, I know that my colleagues who are helping other countries have in the back of their mind that someday I'm going to have to withdraw all of this liquidity. How am I going to do it without destroying the place is a question that's there, but for which I am sure today, nobody has any answer.
Right, and I have another question myself. The next year, the next few years are going to be very, very difficult. I mean, you've described the measures, you've described the speed with which governments need to move to help the poor. What is the risk of instability across sort of large swathes of the world? And what can governments do to instill confidence in their population so that they can cross this difficult period?
If you ask me from direct experience with these countries in South America and the Middle America, address poverty. Income inequality is the main poison that can destroy a society and push people to desperation and push them to take measures that they otherwise would not take. The impact on poverty of the pandemic has been massive, massive. Subsidies have been, savings have been destroyed, disappeared completely. And therefore, you're going to have people suffer. Address this. And this is why when I looked at the fiscal policy, I said we need to generate fiscal space, But the first priority has to be protecting the poor, reducing income inequalities. Protect the poor first, but also reduce income inequality, because there's nothing that destroys a society as much as the poor seeing themselves suffering while somebody else is sunning himself in luxury and in opulence. So we're not saying don't enjoy your money, but we're saying if he's going to enjoy his money, then I must make sure that those who can't have something to look forward to. Employment is important, but addressing the issue of poverty. Make sure that nobody falls off the safety net.
Economic reform and some of the measures that you're describing often leaves people with a kind of a bitter taste in their mouth, because there is always a feeling that the currency devaluation impacts the poor, subsidy reductions impact the poor, but people don't always see a kind of commensurate increase in taxes on the better off. In this kind of crisis, can taxes increase?
No. Look, it depends. It depends on what the situation in country. There is an African country, which also I'm helping, that had to increase taxes because they had no fiscal space. Any fiscal expansion would cause pressure on the exchange rate. The exchange rate would take off, and the little that the poor had would disappear in inflation. So they had to raise taxes. Now, they tried as much as possible to target taxes to the rich, but this is a poor country. There aren't that many rich to tax. So I can't tell you don't raise taxes. You may have a financial situation that requires you to raise, but I would definitely think not twice, 5 times before I raise taxes today. Because today the market is down, incomes are down, demand is down. If you're going to raise taxes, it will shrink demand even more, which will cause even more unemployment. And therefore, I can't give you, it's like you ask a doctor, should I not take aspirin? Well, it depends what you have. You see, so as a first blush, look at your circumstances and think of taxes as a last resort at present. Later on, maybe, but at present, if you can't help it, well, raise tax. But if you can, don't do it.
Right. And we have a question here from an anonymous attendee. And he or she is asking, what are the skills to focus on, in your opinion, given the current situation? Because you said people need skills, not necessarily degrees, but skills. Yeah. And I assume you don't want them to become hackers.
Digital, with a capital D. Learn to use machinery, communication, computers, programming. Now, physical presence is at the premium. Most people avoid it, like we are now. It took me 20 minutes to get on the machine here because I'm so incompetent using a computer. My son, who is 18, came tick, 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 tick. In 3 seconds, I was on. So learn this. Now it's too late for me. I'm not sure I would learn, but learn digital communication skills, digital skills, programming, machinery, anything that does away with physical presence. If you can't do anything, learn to drive, because you will be into the delivery sector, that people will, retail trade will change. Nobody will go into a shop. The shop will come to you. And if you can't do anything else, learn to drive a motorcycle, a car, etc. But if I were to advise my children, engineering, all of the digital skills, computer science, these are the things that are required for tomorrow. We don't know the environment we will be facing tomorrow, but we know that if you have digital skills, you're pretty much safe.
Right, and one last question from Nadim Samna, and it concerns, he says, the current crisis demonstrated the weakness of European economies compared to what they used to be. Will this trend continue post-crisis, and will Europe fall irremediably from its position of a leading economy, or will it be able to recover and resurge?
Well, it's funny you should mention this. I was talking to a number of friends of mine who are in policy-making positions, and one of the results of the pandemic is it created a fault line inside the European Union. You recall that the European Union created a budget that is at the level of the Union, not at the level of the countries. They created a fund, 750 billion euros, where the indebtedness comes at the level of the Union, not at the country level. And they couldn't agree how to distribute the money, whether it would be grants to those countries who did not have fiscal space, or whether it should be loans. And that created a fault line between the rich north, which is conservative, wanted each country to deal with its own problems on its own debt, and the south, which is less prosperous, couldn't deal with the pandemic and needed help. They tried to mutualize the problem and they couldn't agree. And that has caused a fault line to appear in Europe. The south part is resentful from the north, that the north, when they were called upon to help, they said, well, we don't really think so. Why don't you go your own way, etc. He said, why the hell are we in a union then? If when a crisis comes, you're not there to help me. So they created that fund, but they still haven't quite agreed on how to spend it. Whether some of it should be grants, some of it should be loans, they haven't quite agreed. So Europe will survive, there's no problem. It is the largest consumer market in the world, apart from China. It is a very large economy, commensurate with the US, commensurate with China. So it's not going to disappear. It may struggle a bit, but the union itself is going to be put under pressure. The functioning of the union, the Brexit is already putting it under pressure, but the fact that not all the countries in the union have been affected the same way by the pandemic. Some have money and some don't. And those who don't couldn't get the money from those who did. So it created a fault line, but I don't think it may sort of slow Europe down a bit, but not in a secular fashion, not permanent.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yousef. Thank you for a very stimulating conversation. I will hand back now to Dr. Sharif Kamel.
Thank you. Thank you, Heba. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.